Hello. My name's Al Weis. A lot of people during the T3 era called me Darth Vader, especially one of the guys on the panel. First, I just want to talk about some of the guidelines for this panel. Humor is going to rule today. Each of the panelists have about 5 to 7 minutes, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. So there's going to be just a little different. So you can start thinking about questions as we're talking. Each of the panelists is going to look at this elephant from a different perspective. So once again, I gave the panelists rules. Humor. It's kind of like late in the afternoon, everyone's had lunch. So we're just going to make this a little more, hopefully, enjoyable. I've asked each of the panelists to try to remember most what they wanted to forget, and to bring humor to it and make it a sort of a fun storytelling experience. As everyone here knows, you know, ANS and the T3 network was born at a time of change. A change that occurred so fast that when I look back, and I've tried not to, it's a wonder that we survived and made it. ANS was only in the internet business for 4 years and 5 months. And about 3 years in, we started to think about getting out. And I think Jordan talked to me yesterday about my initial plan was 3 years. So it lasted a little longer than we had anticipated. The rest of the time, and ANS is still in existence, the rest of the time after that, 4 years, 5 months, we've been giving the money that we earned during those 4 years, 5 months away to advance education through the use of technology, mostly K-12 inner city. Now to the panels. You have the abstract of the session, so I'm not going to take your time and go over it again. The panelists in the order that they're going to speak are Steve Wolff, who's now at Cisco, but in a former life he was at NSF, and the person I believe that's the most responsible for the internet as we know it today. He made most of the hard decisions that went into the real controversial decisions that commercialized the net. And these were really gut-wrenching, hard things. He has guts, brains, and style, and today we're going to find out if he has humor. Jordan Becker is now Senior Vice President and Chief Technical Officer of Commercial Business at SIAC. He was the Vice President at ANS that directed and managed the T3 network and built a lot of the routing extensions for the T3 routers. His group was responsible for most of the scaling and speed decisions at ANS. And most importantly, he was more responsible for keeping my blood pressure down below 200 than all the wine Bill Schrader didn't give me. Bharath Kadaba, who's now the Senior Vice President of Media Engineering at Yahoo, led the technology group at IBM that built the T3 routers that were used to provide the underlying T3 service. He took his job in October of '91, shortly after we had a day with 60 outages. 60 outages on the T3 router in one day. Within 6 months, and thank God he did, we were stable and rock solid. He made me smile, but boy, did I yell at him for a while. Time changed in IBM as the technology grew, And he saw the changes within IBM and how it affected IBM's participation. Bill Schrader was the president and CEO of Nsfnet, and later PSI. He was the first to take a regional network commercial and was one of the first to realize that the internet had more potential than just connecting universities. He had a really important role in the way the internet evolved. I can't give him enough credit. Anyone here that knows Bill and my relationship with Bill understands the warmth between us. And John Markoff, who is a senior writer for the New York Times, is our last panelist. And they'll talk in the order that I've just discussed. John's covered computer and technology issues since I was 7 years old. He's also the author of many books, and he's been named one of the most influential reporters of our time. His articles not only report on history, but I can say they change it. They really do. John has an interesting view of this time in history. Now, before I pass this along to the panelists, I want them to just answer one more question. And this is a question that I tried once to have a bunch of panelists in Japan answer, and I spent an hour trying to translate it. And that is, what network could a network work if a network could network? Steve? You have to answer that.
Thank you, Al. Well, yeah. It's pretty daunting to be commanded to be humorous, but it's not my nature. I would like to talk a little bit about ANS and about ANS CO plus RE when the for-profit subsidiary of ANS was formed. And it was discovered, to everyone's horror, that Nsfnet backbone packets were getting mixed up with dirty commercial packets on the same wires. The deputy director of NSF came to me and said, "Of course, you're keeping track of this." I said, No. We are buying a service from ANS. Well, how do you know you're getting your money's worth? I didn't ask him how he knew he was getting his money's worth on any other NSF grant. But one could put up with this sort of thing. But then there was an organization that has since been disbanded called the Office of Technology Assessment. And it hired a Russian historian by the name of Gordon Cook. I remember visiting OTA and at Gordon's invitation and talking about NSFNet, about ANS, and about the mixture of commercial and academic traffic, and the acceptable use policy, and all that whole. And after Gordon left OTA in 1992 and started his own investigative reporting business, I turned into NSF's Chief Freedom of Information Act officer because I was fielding 2 to 3 FOIA requests from Gordon every week, which left, probably a good thing, it left little time for me to meddle in the affairs of NSFNet. That went on for long enough that eventually it caught the attention of the Inspector General at NSF. You did ask me to talk about the things I'd rather forget. Right?
Absolutely. Yes.
So the Inspector General started an investigation of NSFNet. And at the time, you have to understand, I was very much more natty dresser than I am nowadays, and I used to wear bow ties and things like that. And what aggravated me most about the NSF's IG investigation was not the fact that they didn't understand anything about networking, not the fact that they didn't understand why we weren't going to charge more for domain names, the fact that they didn't understand why we didn't pay by the packet, but that the investigator that they put on me had the nerve to wear a bow tie. And he couldn't even tie it. It was a clip-on. I'm done.
Thanks, Al. I started in the project in the beginning with the IBM research team, and then Al convinced me that I wasn't having enough fun working on the program management for the T1 network for IBM. So I joined ANS with Al in September of 1990, right in the early days, the middle of development of the T3 network. And we heard from Mark Knopper in the last panel about a lot of the challenges. And there were tough times. And I think one way I look at that in retrospect is that if you're not having problems of that order, then you're not taking enough risks. And we certainly took more than our fair share of risks, I think. The origin of, there were two generations of the T3 network. I think somebody mentioned the Hawthorne cards, and that was named after the Hawthorne lab at IBM Research in New York, where we started with some hardware that originally was developed for FDDI, that we had a team of hardware designers that felt they could adapt it to 45 megabit. And we had looked all around inside of IBM and elsewhere in the industry. There really was not a ready-to-go T3 technology at that time. In fact, we went up to IBM's mainframe group in Kingston, and they had a product that they thought could do the job. It was about a refrigerator-sized piece of equipment. It must have had about 100 fans in it. And I remember they asked us what we thought, and we said, well, this isn't going to route packets, but if you put wings on it, it'll surely fly. And so we defaulted back to the IBM research technology, and somebody came up with an interesting idea, which was we didn't have 45 megabit logic to drive a clear channel 45 megabit T3 line, but we did have 22 megabit logic, and if we figured out how to take two of those and put them on a card and inverse multiplex them together, we could drive a 45 megabit line, and it seemed like a good idea at the time. When we started the program for T3, we had two objectives. One, I think we were trying to get our first production capability within about a year, and we had a demonstration we wanted to do in spring of 1990, the National Net 90 conference, which was at the L'Enfant Plaza in Washington, D.C., and we did show up, and we did a demonstration of that technology. It was barely working at the time, and it was notable for the fact that we took over a conference room, and the hotel really had no clue what we were doing. I think they're still repairing that room to this day. We had 3 or 4 of these big IBM RS6000 cabinets, and these adapters, these Hawthorne cards, were so big and had heat sinks so large that you could only fit 2 of them in a big IBM RS6000 frame, and we had to cut the top off so they would stick out the top, and the room immediately heated up to over 100 degrees. We had to take out the ceiling tiles in the room, and somebody, I don't know if it was Steve Heimlich, befriended the food and beverage manager at the hotel, and we got a couple of ice swans to cool them. So we had fans sitting at the back of the room blowing on an ice swan to cool the equipment. But we got it to work for that demonstration. I think that was also
when was this?
This was March of 1990. After that, we continued on, and I think it was late 1990 when we started the first deployment of the T3 network, and we had lots of problems, as everybody knows and has been discussed here. Operationally, I would say it was a big challenge in addition to the technology issues. Later on, thankfully to Bharath and his team, they came along with the next generation, what we called the RS960 technology, which took all the hard lessons learned from that first set of experiments and really built a production solid capability for us. Operationally, as Mark said, it was a nightmare for about almost 2 years, and we did a number of things to work that, and I think we did a very good job operationally. We created a team in Ann Arbor, Michigan, that was essentially a group of over-caffeinated kids from the university, many of whom are here today. And we called them the National Network Attack Force. And it included Eric Bennett, Craig Owen, Nasser El-Awar, Sarpil Baraktar, Selena Priestley, Kim Smith. And we told them their mission was, we're giving you a mouse, an X-Windows terminal, maybe a badge and a siren, and your mission is to go out and fix problems and do good on the network. And they worked 7 by 24 and really did the best they could to keep the network operational. And it was a challenge. And then Mark, as he mentioned, came on and tried to keep them from getting in trouble, which was a tall order. Rob Lehman and Brian Beecher, I think, then took that role on subsequently. And we had some stabilizing influences. John Labby, Deb Boyer, who ran the operations center, Sue Blair, who was semi-stabilizing, and Lon Lowen, for those of you who know Sue. And we had great support also from the field team, because if you think about it, in those days, it was very unusual to co-locate equipment in a carrier central office, but because of the economics of 45 megabits, there was no other way to do it. And so we had to build cages, essentially. MCI gave us our little caged space in their facilities where we would put our equipment, and they had people who became skilled in operating or either power cycling or managing this equipment for us. And we had individuals at each of those locations that did the work. And we had a great team from IBM. Tom Stix and Al Watley were flying around the country. And we had a lot of challenges. I remember during the LA riots, I don't remember exactly when that was, we sent a team we had a facility out in Dominguez Hills, California, one of the MCI facilities. And we had to do some major upgrades, and that node was in trouble. We sent a team out. They took food, sleeping bags, and barricaded themselves in for, I think it was 48 hours to keep that facility running and do the maintenance they needed to do. I think the saving to all of that was the RS-960 technology, which came along shortly thereafter, and things got a lot better until we had the routing crisis that I think was discussed earlier with the, as Jessica showed on that chart, the explosion of the size of the routing table in the 90, actually with the emergence of the T1 Nsfnet. And a plan was developed for classless interdomain routing, and that had to be implemented in the BGP4 protocol that Yakov talked about. Dennis Ferguson did that work for us in the GateD software system, which was upgraded onto the IBM routers towards the, I guess it was 93, 94 timeframe. And that created that stabilizing effect in the route table explosion that Jessica showed you. But it was touch and go there for a while. We had problems where a lot of the software that had been developed over these years, we had a previous piece of software called RCP RouteD, which Yakov remembers, and it was kind of a La Brea tar pit, not only of every routing protocol that we had ever seen, but every programming methodology, probably dating back to the 70s. And you could see as you look through that code, we replaced that with Dennis's code, the GateD implementation, and that stabilized things quite a bit, and I think we were on good solid ground from that point going forward. In summary, I think the key lessons learned that I came away with from this project were, if you have good people, they become great when you present them with what's a seemingly insurmountable challenge, and you give them the trust to take risks without fear of any individual consequences from failure, and we certainly had that. It's also amazing how hard you'll get people to work with relatively little reward when they have a chance to do something that's important and hasn't been done before, and that was clearly the case in the T3 network. And also maintaining your sense of humor, Al, in the face of chaos and adversity, takes the edge off the anxiety, even if those circumstances don't seem very funny at the time. So with that, I'll conclude.
Bharath? Thank you.
So, 1991, I was in IBM T.J. Watson Research Center, and I was in Hawthorne. And I had nothing to do with the Hawthorne cards that were developed, by the way. However, I was in Hawthorne. I had, having spent 10 years in IBM research, I was pretty successful. I had about 40 people reporting to me. I was responsible for a lot of the networking research and had zero experience in terms of building any real software or hardware, for that matter. But I was looking for change. And I had no idea that the National Science Foundation network that was housed in Milford was a potential project that I could go to. Till one day, I think Allan Barrett, who was also at Hawthorne, took the job. I think Weis convinced him that he should do that. And Allan Barrett came to me one day and said, hey, you're looking for change. Why don't you come to Milford and manage a team of people building this stuff? And I, without asking any due diligence questions at all, I was incredibly young and naive and foolish, and left research. And a lot of people looked at me and said, why are you leaving research? It's a wonderful job. It's really an 8 to 6 kind of a job, and all of that. But I said, no, I want to do this. And then, of course, as Al mentioned earlier, the week that I took over, we had this massive outages on the backbone. And then I also not only had to face Al Weis shouting at me constantly, I also discovered that at that point, John Armstrong, who is here, he was the senior vice president of IBM at that point, and he was actually getting on phone calls every week, asking questions about all the outages and wanting to know the bug counts and what was the status of those bugs and so on. So I had to face John Armstrong every week to explain to him where we were on that. And then, of course, as you will hear from John Markoff, there were articles that were being published that basically said that IBM is abusing the National Science Foundation funding by deploying experimental routers on the internet backbone. So that was the pressure cooker environment that I was thrown into. But the good news was, in spite of the fact, and I've learned since then how critical collaboration can be, and the fact that we had, obviously, NSF looking over us and sponsoring us, but we had Marriott, ANS, IBM, MCI, all collaborating to make this happen, turned out to be a wonderful experience. So I'm happy to say that I could actually do all the things that we were supposed to get done to fix all the bugs, deploy the next generation technologies. And of course, it was not just stabilizing the network that was the challenge. The challenge was also the constant growth, right? And people have talked about the 11 to 20% traffic growth every month, the routing tables growing exponentially. So what we had to do was not only fix these problems, we had to deploy new generation technologies. And that's where I learned how to do software development cycles in 3 months and hardware development cycles in 11 months. And that was an incredible pace that we lived. And I know that, a lot of the people in this room were with me at that point, people like John Leddy, Lou Steinberg. And these guys were putting in 24 hours a day and chewing on coffee beans all night, trying to make sure that we could get this done. And we also, IBM, it has to be said that IBM was incredibly supportive throughout the process. We actually doubled the staff. I think I had about 50 or 60 people when I joined. I think by the time I left in 1994, we had about 150 people focused on the internet backbone. So the amount of investment that went in, and talk about the level of investment. I think somebody mentioned earlier this morning that NSF funded up to about $55 million in this history of the Nsfnet, but I think IBM probably spent over $100 million in making this work. And that was the commitment that we had, and that was the commitment the team had to make that work. So I really want to thank IBM and all of the people who were part of that team to make that successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Earlier in the sessions this morning, you heard a lot about partnerships and how easy it was for everyone to work together. And there was also a statement, I think, by Eric that he wanted to be able to capture, or maybe by Doug, how to capture to do this again and again in the future. And lest you go away with the misinterpretation that it was all about partnership and friendliness, I must tell you, it's not what I remember. So, my memory, if it serves me well, and I'm not the youngest guy in the room, is it was a series of battles. They were non-continuous. Sometimes they actually had starts and ends, such as when Mark Fedora and Marty Schofstall wrote SNMP, and we were fighting the technical battle of SNMP versus CMIP, CMOT, and HEMS, all funded heavily by DARPA and others. And eventually they went away and SNMP won. And that was the end of that battle. But that took 2 years, and there was a lot of discussion. I think it's called discussion. They were vehement arguments. We had pins, where's the CMIP, on our lapels. And then, so the technology arguments were profound. And I think they were buried inside of IETF in all of the suits. Those of us sitting, well, not all of us are suits, some of us are technical. But the technologists tried to keep it away from us so we wouldn't know about it. And Steve is technical enough to know about it, Dennis Jennings. In fact, the only time I remember when it was peaceful was when we set up the first 56 kilobit network out in Boulder with Jennings. And it was actually a very calm discussion with a little bit of foot pounding where Ken had his shoe off and he actually forgot that he took his shoe off and was pounding the table. But that was the calmest day of the whole 15 years I remember in the internet. So talk about policy debates, discussions, battles. When ANS came out, they came out with something called COMBITS, and we were opposed to it thinking that settlements was important. And we went to battle over that, and we had mediators, and boy, we used the press. We used the press against Al, and we had a few, press guys that fell for our side, and the same press guys fell for his side, and so it was a series of very nasty drag-out battles that I think produced what my partner Marty Schofstall calls iron sharpens iron, and you end up with some very sharp arguments, and everyone had respect on both sides. And in the end, we had an outcome. That outcome is the best we could have done given what we knew at the time. Now, I dare anybody here to answer the question that Al's going to ask us, what would you do differently if you could, and come up with a legitimate answer that, doesn't change something else. So, and just a few observations other than the battles versus pure partnership and joy. There were 2 decades in the internet that I have always characterized as the military season. That was the 60s and the 70s, ARPANET and MILNET, although MILNET came later. And then the academic season, which was the 80s, and that was a combination of the backbone and all the regionals and the thing that most people never talk about, which are the thousands of people who are responsible for the success of the Nsfnet backbone and the Nsfnet, who are sitting in the campuses that the regionals, regional network, NISRNet, that Richard and dozens of people founded, including Al Weis, all co-founding Ken King. I think Ken and Ken Wilson Ken King and Ken Wilson together had the first idea for NISRNet. But thousands of men and women in all those campuses that we connected to, and thousands in the regional networks that made this thing work while we were doing our battles. That's an amazing feat. So during the 90s, my view was that we were commercializing that academic network, and that was a commercialization season. I think Steve was essential as being the focal point of all of my anger during the early part of the 90s so that I could support Gordon Bell and his FOIAs going against him so he would be an annoyance. And then Gordon Cook, sorry, not Gordon Bell, sorry. Although Gordon Cook. And so in the end, it really did drift towards full commercialization in mid-90s until it was commercialized at the end. And now what we see, and it's where I think we've missed, we haven't discussed what the future lies here, but what's the future look like? Now it's industrialization seasons. This is the 2000s, and what does it look like for the next 2 decades? And I see what's coming as a heavy industrialization of the internet infrastructure. And I'm just really appreciative that Cisco was around and Juniper is around, and that other companies like them will come up again with new ideas, because this is going to get bigger and faster and better, and the technology from lasers and fiber to the home, all that is going to put more stress on the system. So, when we get done with this, I'm going to ask a really hard question, like what you think the biggest risk is going forward, not going back. And I'll stop here.
So I was one of a handful of newspaper reporters covering networking during the second half of the 1980s. And as a mainstream press reporter, there weren't very many of us in the country. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about how that came to happen, and a little bit about some of the consequences. First, to calibrate this, I stopped being the internet reporter for the New York Times in 1992, and came out to cover Silicon Valley, came back out to cover Silicon Valley, and Peter Lewis took my place, which dates me. And the other thing I wanted to say first is I think you all know that the real story that I'd love to talk about but won't is how the internet has transformed my employer and is continuing to transform my employer. But that's a subject for another time. The best I can remember, the first time I wrote about the consequence of computer networks was a story that I wrote when I was a starving freelancer in the 1970s about this hypothetical connection between IASA in Austria, which was connected to Russia, the Kremlin perhaps, and the ARPANET, which I thought was potentially very, very cute. And it sort of was my first hint at the implications of the potential power of this technology. The other sort of early influences on me were the fact that I had the good fortune to have a friend who worked at Xerox PARC. And so I saw an Alto and had my mind blown. I also got to play a game, a network game, which I think was written by Rick Rashid, which might have been Network Star Trek, although I can't really remember at this point. But I began to sort of see that world. And then I also had the good fortune to get a ARPANET tip phone number, NASA Ames. I was living and working in Palo Alto, and found my way to an MIT AI account and was able to read HumanNets, which was this wonderful window into a world that was largely hidden to most people that I had very early on. But at the same time, I think, and perhaps maybe even more important, I was a devoted science fiction reader. And I was reading Shockwave Rider, which of course was influenced by the work that John Schock had done at Xerox PARC, and it was about worms and distributed programs. And I think, if any of you have read that book, you remember that I think that the moral of the story was that the only way they could destroy the fascist dictatorship was by destroying the network. And that was already very clear to me. I also read Neuromancer, 1984 book, and 1981 book called True Names by Werner Vinge, a computer scientist, about BBS culture. And so I was in that first half of the 1980s at InfoWorld and Byte, and it looked like life was imitating art. Everything I was writing about I'd already read about in the science fiction world. But for the real sort of mainstream of America, I think there was a singular event that transformed the way and actually sort of made networks visible to the mainstream America for the first time in 1988, and that was the Morris worm. And I went last night. I actually went and looked I did a Nexus search, and I looked at the number of references to the term internet in the nation's newspapers, not the computer worlds and InfoWorlds and network worlds, the technical press, but the mainstream press. And before the Morris worm, I found one reference, which was a news brief in the Wall Street Journal that stated there was going to be a TCP/IP stack added to the Macintosh. I think it appeared in 1988. Now, what surprised me is that in the year afterwards, where to my mind, there was an explosion of interest in the internet. In fact, from looking at Nexus, it looks like there were 135 references in that year that followed to the internet, which to now seems like a tiny number, but it certainly, the Morris worm had this huge effect on me, and it just changed the way I looked at the world. And I think it was the first time that most people in America who were non-technical got some hint of the potential power of this medium. And it certainly transformed it for me. Then, Al asked me to look at the reporting I did on it was, well, not a lot, but there were probably 4 or 5 articles, and there were a number of articles that I wrote about Al Gore's introduction of these bills to create national data highways. And, you know, it turns out that I just feel like there was a fog around it. I went back and I looked at all the notes, and I still can't make a sense of it. I was listening to Al, and then I was listening to Farber and Kapoor, and actually more than Bill, I was listening to Marty Schofstall, who worked with them, and reading Compriv and trying to sort these things out, and I have to confess I still can't sort it out. You know, then there was that period as the network became more and more on the public consciousness over the next 5 years. And, you know, I have to confess that I remain naive because, you know, as it turned out, I also wrote the very first mainstream article, perhaps the very first article, about the impact of the World Wide Web. And, you know, if you go back to that article and you look at my lead, the lead was, think of it as a map to the buried treasures of the information age, which sounds great. Sounds like I'm very prescient, but I have to confess, I was thinking encyclopedia, not Main Street. I just didn't get the economic force that was being brought by this technology and all, even though I was very close, even though I was, you know, hearing what people like Al Gore and the other people who saw this transformation had to say. And so I sort of remained a naive optimist about the internet, I think, until probably the final transforming event for me is when a friend of mine, a guy who's former IBMer and who actually now works at Yahoo, Mark Seiden, went to AOL in, I don't know, it was probably 93, 94, and he did the programming of the first gateway of the AOL to the open internet. And he spent about 2 weeks there, and he came back out to the West Coast, and he just shook his head, and he said, you know, it's like a big city, and people are getting mugged in the back alleys. And at that point, I think it sort of was really driven home to me that, you know, what we had built was a mirror for the real world, and it reflected all of the good and ill that human beings are capable of, and it's sort of continued to be the way I view it. So thank you.
I'd like to thank the panelists. I'd also like to thank the folk that made ANS possible, IBM, MCI, Dick Liebhaber, John Armstrong, Jim McGrady, Doug Van Howling, and a fellow named Jerry Butters, who was at NT. We wouldn't have been able to do what we did if it wasn't for them. I'm going to open this up to the audience for questions. So if anyone has a question, yes.
Al, I've been wanting to, oh, by the way, I'm Steve Goldstein, and you'll hear from me tomorrow, but I was in the NSF group. There's a question I've been wanting to ask you for years, and I asked it in a technical group in the Nsfnet project days. No, wait a minute. And Hans Werner answered me and said, no, I didn't realize that either. The question that I asked was, am I the last guy in the world to realize that ANS is SNA spelled backwards?
I never knew that.
He never knew that.
And let me tell you, that was very far from my intention, but it
now you know, though.
Was an issue. It turned out to be an issue, as John Armstrong mentioned earlier. IBM was funding something that, in the longer term, hurt most probably billions of dollars worth of investment in IBM.
Okay, and I have one more remark for Steve. Your faithful servant was responsible for getting Gordon Cook off your case.
How did you do that?
Well, what I did was, I was actually running a meeting near Moscow that was funded by NATO for coordinating networking in the former USSR. And I knew Gordon was on your case, so I invited him to that meeting to give a paper. And he was so thankful that somebody from NSF recognized that he had some worth in this world, that he was delighted. And I sat up with him till about 3 o'clock one morning, sipping vodka, and explaining to him that it wasn't you who was responsible for getting him fired from his job, there was probably somebody in the White House who's here today, but whose name I won't mention, and that it certainly wasn't Steve Wolff. And from then on in, things were kind of cool. So.
We're wide open. Well, let me ask the panelists, especially Steve and Bill, okay? When you think back, and we're old men now, was there a better way to commercialization? Could we have done it without all the bruises?
No. And I say that because the whole idea was so foreign to everybody that I don't think we could have introduced it gracefully. It took the shock, and it took upstanding people like Bill and Rick Adams to make the point, to make the case for the commercial internet, when the national mindset was that it was a research endeavor and it was an academic endeavor.
Bill?
No, there was no better way, and my reason has more specifics to it. When we formed PSINet, I went person to person around. When I formed PSINet, I went to every single member of the board of Nsfnet face-to-face, one-on-one, and asked them to keep it quiet, and told them I was forming a company and leaving Nsfnet, and we were a DARPA PI, and we were building networks for the Defense Department and other agencies. But I would, make that smooth. But I was leaving, and I wouldn't come back to compete with Nsfnet. But this was too big and too important, based on the research that I'd done just by sitting in the office and making one phone call for every 10 that I received. One phone call to a university asking them if they wanted to get a Nsfnet connection, and meanwhile 10 businesses would call me and ask me where to fax in the order form with $50,000 wired behind it. So this was a commercial opportunity, and I wanted Nsfnet to go commercial. The board had already decided, no, we are not going commercial. So I decided I was leaving. And the last guy I went to see was the one I thought would be most opposed to it, and that was a fellow named Al Weis down in IBM Research. And much to my surprise, he had not heard that what my plans were. No one had told him. And he immediately jumped up and said, what a genius idea. So he was
I voted for it.
He was my strongest supporter, and it was a testament to business being business, but he was still a board member of Nsfnet. So I don't think there was any, once we started PSINet, we were alone. And Allison Brown and a bunch of regional networks had formed FARNet, Federation of American Research Networks, and I went to a FARNet meeting, and an AT&T guy was speaking, and I walked in the back room, and I was shunned. I was the only for-profit guy there, and I was evil. And I got a short story if you want humor. It was a 1-minute story. But whoever was the speaker for AT&T had this story about they were doing an experiment, and they took 2 kids and put them in a room with a pile of horse manure in each one. And the one guy, and then they left him for an hour, and they gave him no instructions. If you've heard this, you have to keep it quiet. So after an hour, they came back, and in the first room, the kid was standing in the corner holding his nose saying, why am I in this room? I don't understand. I mean, just get me out of this room. And then they went to the second room, and they couldn't find the kid. And there's horse manure everywhere around the walls, the ceilings, and they said, hey, kid, where are you? And up comes out from in the middle of this pile the kid. And the guy says, well, what are you doing? He said, well, I don't know, but with all this horse shit around here, there's got to be a pony here somewhere. And the AT&T guy, I was going on to speak after he was done, and he said, and AT&T is the kid in the first room, and the kid in the second room is Bill Schrader, who's taken up now.
We have a question from the audience.
Re-ask Bill's question from earlier is, what are the risks we see going forward? You mentioned this earlier.
Yes.
Why don't we start with Jordan and Bharath, since both of those are going to have to solve some of those problems, and then we'll work our way down.
The risks, I think, today are different than they were back in the days we're talking about here. Today, the issues that seem to plague us involve how to deal with digital rights management and the content side of this, which have become issues, different form of commercial issues, but commercial issues nonetheless. And we see that playing out with a lot of the online content providers, the music industry, the film industry, and I think that set of controversy is just beginning.
Since I run the media engineering group in Yahoo, I know that challenge very well, and we deal with that every day, and certainly you all are familiar with YouTube and the challenges that they face in terms of pirated content showing up everywhere. So that certainly is a challenge. The other one that we see in Yahoo is certainly around personal information and how that is treated on the internet, and that's something that we take extremely seriously, and there is a whole lot of work that we're doing to figure out how to deal with the privacy issues. And the other one I would tack on to earlier that was mentioned is certainly around the fact that we're now seeing finally the dream that we all had, and back in 1993, I would say a lot of us were thinking about gigabit to the home as something that would definitely happen, and I now can see that finally the investments are happening in the US for sure, and already in Korea and Japan you see very high-speed access, and so one of the challenges is really around scalability of the infrastructure itself as people do more and more on the internet.
Just briefly, to note that gigabit networking hasn't come to my neighborhood yet. I think that there's the risk of, there's been a lot written about the potential that America may ironically become a network backwater because of lack of investment, perhaps, at this juncture. And I read the stuff and I look at it, and I remember I went through this period before the sky is falling period. DRAM in Japan, 5th generation computing in Japan, and so you probably should be a little bit skeptical, but it does seem like looking around the world that we're now trailing in a world that we invented.
Bill?
I think all these threats are real, and the biggest single threat economically and to innovation in the future for the next forever in the internet space is the loss of net neutrality, that which we all produced in this room.
I think there are two. Both have been mentioned. First is the privacy issue, which is going to get only worse before it gets better. And the second, in other words, is the re-siloization of services by providers and the loss of neutrality.
I'd like to thank all the panelists and let you go at this moment. And I thank you for listening at this late hour in the afternoon.